Okay, welcome everyone. I'll say good morning and good evening because I think we've got people joining us from all around the world. My name is Dr. Elise McGovern. I'm an Associate Professor in Criminology in the School of Social Sciences. Apologies, my camera's not working today, so that's why you can't see me, but that's okay. I'm not the main focus of today, but I'll be chairing the session. Just to begin with, I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land. Today I'm coming to you from Bidjigal land, and I'd like to pay respects to their elders past and present, and to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. So today we're very excited to be joined by Dr. Robert Werth. This is for one of our seminars for the Centre for Crime, Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales. So Robert is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Rice University in the USA. Robert's work explores how societies think about, produce knowledge on, and govern penal subjects. His current research explores the way in which parole field personnel in the US utilise and deploy technical, moral, and effective knowledges in enacting agency mandates and supervising individuals. His more recent research project focuses on individuals working within legal and criminal justice institutions who advocate for reform of criminal justice practices. Today, Robert is going to present to us from monstrosity to ghostly imaginaries, the spectral haunting threat of paroled sex offenders. Now, just to let you know how this is going to work, Robert's going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. We will have questions at the end, and we'll be using the chat function to do that, and I'll help facilitate that conversation. So if you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat function, and we'll get to them at the end of Robert's presentation. So take it away, Robert.
Thank you very much, Elise, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I wish I could be there in person. Thank you to the University of New South Wales for hosting me, and in particular, the Center for Crime, Law and Justice. And again, a very big thank you to Elise McGovern for inviting me, and Tom Chapman for setting up and making this talk possible. So the talk I'm giving is based on an in-progress article that I'm writing. Originally, it was going to be part of a book chapter in the forthcoming book, Ghost Criminology, edited by Michael Fidler, Theo Kinneas, and Travis Linneman, but the timing didn't work out on my end. So now it's going to be an article. And a special thank you to Travis Linneman, both for inspiration and feedback on this paper. And as it is a work in progress, I think it's a very good point to share, but as it's a work in progress during the discussion or the question and answer session, in addition to questions, I'm quite open to receiving comments, feedback, or even having my arguments pushed. And I'm actually going to talk, I think, closer to 30 minutes. It'll be closer to 30 than 40, so I'm just going to dive right in. In this talk, I explore how the figure of the dangerous sex offender is understood by parole personnel in the United States. It is widely understood that sex offenders are seen as monsters beyond repair or redemption. A number of scholarly accounts observe that sex offenders represent a monstrous being in the imaginaries of criminal justice personnel, legislators and policymakers, and quote unquote, the general public. This article proposes that in addition to monstrosity, we can and should consider the ghostly, spectral, and haunting characteristics of sex offenders. That is, in relation to sex offenders, we need to attend to what Jacques Derrida refers to as the question of ghosts. In fact, I propose that much of the power of the dangerous sex offender to trouble, frighten, and spur extremely punitive action stems from its spectrality. Now, this is not to deny or downplay the role of monstrosity. Parole personnel perceive sex offenders as morally monstrous and irredeemable. At the same time, their perceived threat of sexual reoffending represents a ghostly force that is nearly impossible to deter or contain in the minds of parole personnel. Put another way, although sex offenders may be understood as less than human, they also represent something more than human. They may be seen as unnatural, but they also contain something of the supernatural. While drawing from empirical data, the thrust of my article and my talk today is conceptual. It represents an attempt to think with scholarship on ghost and haunting. I contend that work of this kind helps us better understand how the dangerous sex offender is both imagined and governed within parole. Now, drawing from scholarship in this vein, especially the work of philosopher Jacques Derrida and sociologist Avery Gordon, I argue that the dangerous sex offender is seen as posing a spectral threat in the imaginaries of parole personnel. To be clear, what is perceived as spectral is not the sex offender per se, the sex offender as a person or a subject, but the potential enactment of their criminal sexuality. That is, their potential for recidivism represents a ghostly figure, a spectral threat, an apparition-like absent presence. As something that is both absent and present, something that is both happening and not, the specter of sexual reoffending troubles temporal, spatial, and epistemological boundaries. It blurs or even collapses distinctions or clear distinctions between event and non-event, between probability and certainty, and between past, present, and future. Now, in the longer article, I connect the perceived ghostliness of sex offenders with everyday practices of parole. Specifically, I argue that the spectral nature of the threat posed by sex offenders incites and justifies an approach where parole personnel seek to preempt reoffending by revoking individuals' parole and sending them back to prison. That is, they seek an approach of carceral banishment, of purging dangerous sex offenders from the community. But in today's talk, I'm going to focus only on imaginaries, on how parole personnel come to see sex offenders as a spectral threat. I'll say a very quick word about my methods. So this talk and paper grew out of a long-term, multi-sided ethnographic research project on parole in the state of California in the United States from 2008 to 2016. Data were gathered via participant observation and in-depth interviews. The bulk of this took place with field personnel, so parole field agents and also their immediate on-site supervisors. Fieldwork took place with 40 parole personnel, as well as a number of individuals on parole, of course, also. But the majority of data for today's talk are drawn from a subsection of this data, in particular from 8 people who are both agents and supervisors, 8 parole personnel, who exclusively supervised individuals designated as sex offenders. A substantial body of scholarship explores the ways in which sex offenders are constituted and understood. Within this, a number of authors have turned to monstrosity, contending that sex offenders' conduct, or even their very personhood, is understood as monstrous. It bears noting that in most of these accounts, or at least many of these accounts, monster and monstrosity appear to operate as folk categories or self-evident concepts, as they are not well specified or conceptually developed. However, 2 central themes emerge and are present in much of this work. First, monstrosity is entangled with extreme dangerousness, with assumptions of irredeemability and recidivism. Second, monstrosity represents radical alterity, a profound otherness associated with pollution, revulsion, and disgust. Now, echoing this work and drawing from Foucault's conception of monstrosity, the parole personnel I conducted field work with perceived sex offenders as monstrous, to be sure, as morally unnatural and irredeemable subjects. However, parole agents' imaginaries do not stop at the monstrous. The dangerous sex offender is an overdetermined figure. That is, although monstrosity is accurate, it is incomplete. There are other discourses, assumptions, and affects that constitute this figure. In particular, I contend we need to attend to the ghostly aspects of sex offenders. They represent monsters, to be sure, but they are also viewed as posing a spectral, supernatural, nearly disembodied threat that resists containment. While ghosts have long been topics of curiosity and concern, in the late 20th century, ghosts, spectrality, and haunting all developed into influential conceptual metaphors in academia. Work in this vein has sometimes been labeled the spectral turn, or more commonly, hauntology. This term, coined by Derrida, complicates ontology by, in the words of Colin Davis, replacing the priority of being and presence with the figure of the ghost as that which is neither present nor absent, neither alive nor dead. So Derrida conceived of the ghost as an always already absent presence. As such, it is a deconstructive figure, making established certainties vacillate, or making us question established certainties. Ghosts exist at the interstices of absence-presence, visibility, invisibility, and knowable, unknowable, as well as past, present, and future. This capacity for ontological and temporal disjunctions is at the crux of ghost power to haunt, and it distinguishes ghosts from monsters. Monsters are either present in the flesh or they are not. By contrast, the physical and temporal liminality of ghosts is both how and why they haunt. Now, in drawing from this body of work, I use the term ghost, specter, and haunting metaphorically. However, the ghost is not just a metaphor, it is also concept and actuality. And actuality and the ghost, things perceived as ghostly, produce real social and political effects. Thus, I turn to spectrality and haunting as conceptual lenses to make sense of how sex offenders are actually perceived and the actual social effects they produce or abet in the social world. While considerable attention has been paid to the monstrosity of sex offenders, very little attention has been paid to the question of their ghostly characteristics. In fact, while conceptual work on ghosts has been generative across a number of disciplines and topics, there has been relatively little in relation to crime, punishment, and carcerality, although there are exceptions to this, including the ghost criminology volume I mentioned. While the focus of my article is on the ghostly, the dangerous sex offender traffics in both the monstrous and the spectral. In fact, in this setting, monstrosity and spectrality are not just overlapping, they're deeply entangled. 3 points of clarification about this. First, both monstrosity and spectrality are part of parole personnel's imaginaries of the dangerous sex offender. Both impact how this figure is understood and governed. Second, the monstrosity of the sex offender undergirds their ghostliness. As sex offenders are understood as morally monstrous, as irredeemable recidivists, their potential reoffending is perceived not as a future possibility, but as a future inevitability. This transmutes their threat into an absent presence, into something so assured that it is perceived as there, even when it is not occurring. It is present, even when it is not happening. Third, notwithstanding these entanglements between monstrosity and spectrality, I suggest that being placed on parole somewhat weakens or attenuates the monstrosity of sex offenders while simultaneously unleashing their spectrality. While my interlocutors view sex offenders as monstrous, they are monsters subject to penal intervention, including practices of risk assessment, surveillance, electronic monitoring, which do not erase assumptions of otherness or monstrosity, but it does mark sex offenders as subjects that can be announced, classified, located, and legally acted upon. Derrida contends that, quote, monsters cannot be announced. One cannot say, here are our monsters, without immediately turning the monster into pets, end quote. Now, while the term pet seems like a choice of amplification, it does seem probable that being subject to parole governance tames or lessens, to some degree, the monstrosity of the sex offender. But it has the opposite effect on their ghostliness. Being placed on parole, where prison walls give way to sporadic surveillance in the community, allows the threat of sex offenders to intensify, disperse, and move freely throughout society. All right, this next section is called The Dangerous Sex Offender, the moral monster who must and will reoffend. Amongst almost all interlocutors, my research participants, the dangerous sex offender was understood as someone driven by a compulsion to engage in aberrant, harmful sexuality. And this compulsion is viewed as something that would, sooner or later, override the reason, ethics, and self-interest of sex offenders. That is, the sex offender is constituted as someone destined to reoffend sexually. This constructs the dangerous sex offender as a particular subject, the subject who will reoffend. Importantly, this is not the subject who may reoffend or even the subject likely to reoffend, that is, the high-risk offender. Rather, the dangerous sex offender is the subject who will definitely reoffend. This closely resembles Zizek's conception of the subject supposed to offend, That is, the subject whose offending can be anticipated with confidence or near certainty. Interlocutors talked regularly and matter-of-factly about the certainty of recidivism of sex offenders. One agent, for instance, noted, quote, "These guys can't help themselves. Even if they want to, they just can't stop themselves," end quote. In fact, as they are understood as individuals subject to overpowering compulsions, the dangerous sex offender is produced not just as the subject who will recidivate, but as the subject who is compelled to offend. That is, the subject who must reoffend. Of course, the subject who both must and will reoffend is a contradiction, as it is impossible to know with certainty what anyone will do in the future. Yet, the belief that they will definitely reoffend is both foundational and fundamental for parole personnel. Foundational in that it animates the dangerous sex offender as a category distinct from other types of offenders. And it is fundamental in the sense that it is a central and orienting idea, but one without much regard for peripheral details or exceptions. This belief is a flexible knowledge rather than an absolute one. It rests on multiple registers, both ideological and affective, and it adapts to exceptions. This belief could be considered a near or quasi-certainty masquerading as certainty, because following some questioning from me, interlocutors would admit that they could not be completely sure that individuals would recidivate. As an example, one agent told me, "Yeah, you can never be completely sure, but you know what? I am sure," end quote. And another one said, "Okay, you can't be 100% certain they will reoffend, of course, but I'm 99.9% certain." So rather than representing an ideological certainty, I suggest that knowing in this way represents an effective certainty, or borrowing from the work of Brian Masumi, an effectively legitimated fact, a felt commitment to the sex offender as a recidivist. Now, in addition to the difficulties of predicting the future, the subject who will reoffend must contend with empirical evidence that runs counter to it. A number of studies suggest that the recidivism rate of sex offenders is quite low generally and lower than that of other penal subjects. Among parole personnel who supervise sex offenders, everyone seemed to be aware of these studies, although they had not directly read them. Now, while these studies directly challenge and in fact contradict the idea of inescapable recidivism, interlocutors largely dismissed these studies due to what they saw as the difficulties of detecting and documenting sexual reoffending. As one agent noted, quote, "Just because we don't catch them doesn't mean they aren't doing it," end quote. Now, the next section is called the spectral threat of sexual recidivism. Now, as the previous section shows, as a person, the dangerous sex offender is imagined as a morally monstrous, compulsive being who is destined to reoffend. It is precisely the belief that they will reoffend, operating as a certainty, that undergirds the spectrality of sex offenders' threat. What is perceived as spectral is not the person or character of the sex offender, but their potential enactment of sexual reoffending. That is, the specter is their potential for recidivism. For interlocutors, this threat represents a ghostly, absent presence. Absent because it has not yet occurred. Present because it is anticipated as an inevitable future fact, because what is definitely coming is already here to some degree. For parole personnel, sexual reoffending confounds the clear delineation between happening and not happening. It becomes an emergent event, an unfolding process. Now, the absent presence of reoffending entails temporal, spatial, and epistemological dimensions. It unsettles things in these arenas, and I'll talk about each of the three briefly. So ghosts put time out of place. As Avery Gordon notes, being haunted alters the experience of being in linear time, alters the way we normally separate the past, the present, and the future. And this is very much the case for sexual reoffending. The absent presence of this threat plays out across a non-linear temporality that involves temporal linkages or even jumps. The first linkage is from the past to the future. The past sex crimes of the dangerous sex offender are projected into the future. They are mimetically reproduced in an imagined future. For interlocutors, this is not the past pointing out possibilities. This is the past determining the future, foreordaining the future, and saying reoffending is coming. Yet the imagined reoffending of dangerous sex offenders does not only remain in the future, it travels from the future into the present. That's the second temporal linkage. Once reoffending is imagined as a future fact, it begins to bleed into the present and manifest itself. Parole personnel do not only expect reoffending on the distant horizon, they begin to see, sense, or intuit it in the current moment. In the process, sexual reoffending becomes emergent, mirroring anthropologist Joe Masco's observation that terrorist acts are understood by the US security state as emergent, as continuously unfolding regardless of whether they occur or not. Parole personnel come to see the dangerous sex offender's recidivism as an in-the-process event, something that is becoming but not yet finalized. In this way, it occupies a temporality of emergence that blurs present and future, effectively folding and suturing them together. Through the register of affect, the future comes into the present as an effective reality, as something felt to be certain in the here and now by parole agents. This imagined future bleeds into the present in multiple ways. Sometimes reoffending is perceived by parole personnel as emerging because they see precursors or elements of it in the present. Undergirding this, interlocutors conceived of sexual offending as involving a cycle, a process that entails multiple events and unfolds over time. Although they sometimes talked about recidivism as something that had or had not occurred, that is, as a discrete event, reoffending was seen as something that often involved preparatory actions or a series of steps. Now, this was not a precise set of procedures, but it involved things such as fantasizing about offending, being overtaken by compulsions, searching for potential victims, or grooming victims. To a degree, these events represented warnings that reoffending was coming soon. Yet in other ways, parole personnel conceived of actions such as these as part and parcel of reoffending. That is, if someone was in the cycle, they had already begun the process of reoffending. Parole personnel regularly looked for signs that dangerous sex offenders were in the cycle. One way they did this was by reviewing the tracks of sex offenders. Tracks refer to the archive produced by electronic monitoring that shows everywhere that a person has recently traveled on a map. When doing so, interlocutors would look to see, for instance, if someone had been hanging around a neighborhood where a previous victim lives. Or with pedophiles, they would check to see if individuals were spending time in busy areas, such as parks, schools, or busy commercial districts, as this might be a sign that they were searching for or grooming victims. Another way interlocutors looked for signs that reoffending was emerging was by searching individuals' residences during home visits to see if they possessed worrisome items such as pornography, children's toys, or condoms. A classic trope of ghosts is the idea of the past haunting the present. Something or someone from the past reappears, reminding observers of its past existence and lingering effects. With sexual reoffending, there is an aspect of the past haunting the present, to be sure, right? But as this section shows, the temporality at play here is complex and circuitous. The present is haunted by the past, but the present is also haunted by the future. The specter of sexual reoffending is akin to what Derrida terms an arrivant ghost, a ghost that announces not what was, but what is coming. In addition to the past, parole personnel were haunted, were haunted by reoffending that was understood as on its way or already unfolding. Although this echoes Wendy Brown's observation that with specters and ghosts, we can see the ways in which the future is already populated with possibilities from the past. Although for research participants, more than possibilities, the future and the present are inhabited by visceral certainties. The past has colonized the future, and this already decided future sits on the horizon, approaching quickly and actually spilling into the present. Now, in addition to temporal elements, the spectrality of sex offending involves spatial dimensions. The threat of reoffending is perceived as highly mobile and pervasive. It spreads throughout society, flaunting established spatial boundaries and norms. This includes spatial restrictions imposed by the parole agency. As part of Jessica's law, sex offenders were prohibited from residing within 2,000 feet from a park or a school, and many were prohibited from entering or even traveling near these areas by specific parole rules as well. Further, most were subject to electronic monitoring, envisioned as a way to ensure compliance with these regulations. Yet interlocutors noted that neither the prohibitions nor electronic monitoring guarantees that sex offenders and sex offending will stay out of these areas. In fact, electronic monitoring was seen as a retrospective technology, always trailing behind where sex offenders went and what they did. So essentially, electronic monitoring is seen as something that can document where people go, but it cannot effectively remove the threat of sexual offending from parks or schools. And while parks and schools were areas of particular concern, the threat of sexual reoffending was seen as extending throughout the community, occupying both public and private spaces. Sexual reoffending does not only resist the spatial regulations of the parole agency, it flaunts established norms and cultural conceptions of space as well. In particular, dangerous sex offenders bring sexuality into the public realm, whether public is understood as state property or as common use area. Interlocutors worry that sex offenders would not only search for and groom victims in public spaces, but that they would reoffend in public spaces as well. For instance, they talked about how sex offenders might expose themselves on a city street or masturbate in their car while parked outside of a busy shopping mall. I contend that these scenarios of imagined reoffending, something interlocutors mused about with some regularity, were not attempts to predict the conduct of a specific person. Instead, they represented ruminations about the dispersal of the threat, sexual reoffending, how it spreads throughout society. They operated as warnings about how reoffending ignores the boundary between public and private and turns even seemingly safe spaces into imperiled territory. The specter of sexual reoffending does not respect liberal ideas about sexuality being sealed in the private sphere. Rather, the specter of sexual reoffending is perceived as following a logic of dispersal or diffusion. Once present, it immediately spreads throughout the social field. This dispersal logic resembles ideas of moral contagion, but it is more akin to pollution, as sexual reoffending spreads via dispersal in space rather than being spread from person to person. So walls and social distancing won't work with something that's dispersed as pollution. At the same time, in addition to the logic of dispersal, the specter of sexual reoffending is animated by a logic of eruption. Understanding the dangerous sex offender as sexually compulsive invests their future reoffending with volatility. Recidivism becomes something that can occur or erupt suddenly, unpredictably. Reflecting this, interlocutors mentioned concern that something, such as watching a racy TV show or seeing an ad, might trigger reoffending. And the imagined scenarios where participants talked about potential forms and locations of recidivism reflected concern not only about the spatial spread of reoffending, but also about the inability of sex offenders to exercise self-control. Together, the logics of spatial dispersal and eruption give the specter of sexual reoffending a charged pervasiveness, something approaching omnipresence in the minds of parole personnel. So lastly, in addition to temporality and space, the specter of sexual reoffending unsettles epistemological boundaries. It is an unruly figure that defies easy understanding or confirmation. One way this happens is through disrupting the relationship between materiality and visibility. In everyday understandings, things that are visible to us must be material, while immaterial things are not visible. Yet, as Derrida highlights, ghosts transgress or even invert these rules. He contends that the presence of a ghost is the visibility of a body or event which is not present in the flesh and blood. That is, even though ghosts are not materially present, they can nonetheless be seen. In the case of paroled sex offenders, I contend that even when reoffending has not occurred in the flesh and blood, it was nonetheless visible and in fact obvious to parole personnel. In this way, parole personnel are akin to the child in the movie The Sixth Sense, for anyone who's seen it. Like that child, they can see ghosts in their immediate environment that others may not see. Derrida's conception of visibility would seem to exceed the ocular and refer to perception more broadly. Here, visible reads as perceptible, something that can be seen, noticed, or sensed. For parole agents, I contend that the visibility of sexual offending operated on the register of affect. They effectively sensed that reoffending was emerging. It was really felt to be there. But their perceptions also entailed traditional sight. Reoffending was visible in the traditional sense of the word when parole actors observed signs that someone was in the cycle of reoffending. Seeing someone engage in these behaviors meant that the process of recidivism had begun, although it had not yet been completed. In these situations, reoffending could be understood to be partially visible, a part of sexual offending. The initial stages of it could be seen, and interlocutors assumed that the rest of the picture would soon be filled in. A final way in which sexual reoffending troubles epistemology is through confounding and wavering between the categories of event and non-event. The threat of sexual reoffending is spectral to interlocutors precisely because it represents an absent presence. Both materially and temporally, reoffending is there and not there. Thus, as an object of practical concern, sexual reoffending has a precarious and confounding existence. While interlocutors were certain that it would occur at some point, they struggled to determine whether it had already occurred, was in the process of occurring, or was yet to come. In this way, for parole actors, sexual reoffending comes to represent what anthropologist Elizabeth Pavanelli terms a quasi-event. Quasi-events, quote, never quite achieve the status of having occurred or taken place, end quote. That is, they do not quite cross the threshold of being a readily perceivable event. Pavanelli's concept focuses less on the empirical status of an event. Did it happen or did it not happen? Rather, it calls attention to the difficulty of perceiving and determining whether something has occurred or not. It highlights the complications involved in isolating practice as a discrete, confirmable event, since much of what occurs in the social world, Pavanelli notes, entails, quote, a continuous action without any reference to its beginning or end, and outside the dialectic of presence and absence, end quote. So sexual offending troubles interlocutors' attempts to confirm that has taken place because of the practical difficulties of detecting sex crimes, yes, but it also troubles because of its inherently spectral character, because reoffending represent an emergent entity, a continual becoming. That is, specters trouble because we don't know if they are there or not out of ignorance, but because phenomena that are both absent and present, or at least perceived as absent and present, defy our traditional modalities of knowledge. And I will conclude quite briefly by saying that sex offenders, especially pedophiles, are understood as monsters. That has been well documented both in academia, but we can also see it in media portrayals, cinematic representations, and social media discussions. However, I contend that in many scholarly accounts, monstrosity is conceptually underdeveloped. And further, I might suggest that as a concept, we have overburdened monstrosity, sometimes asking it to account for too much. While important, I contend that monstrosity is a partial account of how sex offenders are imagined and hence governed. We would benefit from also attending to the spectral and haunting characteristics of sex offenders and the threat they are perceived as posing, and from tracing the ways in which monstrosity and spectrality entangle together and mark the sex offender as an intolerable threat in need of social exile. And with that, I will stop, and I very much look forward to questions, comments, or disagreements for that matter.
Thank you, Robert. I can see that there's a couple of questions already in the chat, so I'm going to read those out. So if anyone else has any questions, we've got sort of 20-25 minutes to address those. I'll start with the first one from Clinician 17. So they asked, does their spectrality render perceptions of rehabilitation as futile? If the threat of reoffending is spectral, then no matter what concrete steps are taken to mitigate risk, the ghostly threat means the potential for recidivism is always the focus. Just like you can't kill a ghost because it's not alive to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Elise, should I go ahead and respond to that? And then
yeah, sure. Yeah, and then we'll work through the rest. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And yes, amongst the people I did field work with, I would say the spectrality and the monstrosity, or the perception that sex offenders are both monsters and present a ghostly threat, does indeed render rehabilitation as futile in the minds of these parole agents. They really see sex offenders as aberrant, extremely pathological subjects who are quote unquote just different than you and I, and they don't think they can change. So yes, I would say that the monstrosity already renders rehabilitation futile in these parole personnel's minds, but their spectrality makes them not only not reformable, but extremely dangerous and mobile. That's what I would say to that very good question.
Okay, Lisa has asked, you have talked about parole officers who have solely high-risk sex offender caseloads. Were other officers supervising sex offenders amongst other types of offenders? Was there a difference in their attitudes and procedures? Did perceived risk level make a difference?
Yes, that is a good question. Yes, it did. And because in the talk I shortened some of the article, I need to note that my focus is on what I call the dangerous sex offender, which in the minds of parole agents is a particular kind of sex offender. So yes, Lisa's question is spot on. Not all people institutionally designated as sex offenders by the parole agency were seen as monstrous, ghostly threats. This was a subset of individuals. For instance, just as one example, one parole agent told me about an individual who was classified as a sex offender and was on parole, but how he had become a sex offender was by mooning, by showing his bare bottom to his neighbor, or actually to a friend, and his neighbor reported him. So the parole agent explained to me, this person is not a particularly dangerous person or an irredeemable person or somebody I need to worry about. So this isn't all sex offenders. My article is about a particular subset who are, some other scholars have called them sexually violent predators or pedophiles, or Roger Lancaster has called them sex monsters, if I'm remembering the right term. But these are people who are seen as particularly aberrant, pathological, and dangerous. It's not all sex offenders to parole agents that seem this way.
Okay, Dave McDonald has asked, well, he said first, thanks, Robert. He said, super interesting. Don't monsters haunt? Aren't they spectral? I don't disagree with the ghost-like qualities you've described, but I'm not sure that monstrosity fails to allow for this in the way you seem to imply.
That's something that on some level, I have some opinions about that I'll state, where I think there are some differences between monsters and ghosts, but I'm open to being pushed on this. I think, Dave, you are making an important point. But in my reading, I'm thinking here a little bit with Foucault's conception of the monster. And in Foucault's conception of the monster, historically, the monster was that which was unnatural. It was an unnatural combination of human and animal, like things that shouldn't exist in nature, but yet existed, were monsters. Although he noted that then monstrosity morphed in the 18th and 19th century into moral monstrosity, right? But thinking with that classic trope, or that classic understanding of monster as an unnatural figure, can monsters haunt us? Yes, absolutely. Can monsters not only can and do monsters frighten, haunt, and trouble us? Yes, absolutely. But by the same token, in my understanding, or the way I'm thinking about it, monsters are physical beings that can be either present or not present, can be touched, can be locked up, although they can be wandering the countryside and worrying us considerably. So I think Dave's comment is spot on the money, but ghosts themselves are something that we can't quite determine whether they exist or don't exist. So how I will wrap this up for now, although I want to think more about Dave's question, is that what is monstrous here are the sex offenders as individuals, right? As these unnatural, particularly morally unnatural creatures. But their threat of reoffending is something that parole agents aren't quite sure if it's there or not there, if it's happening or not happening. So I would argue that while monstrosity is an important part of this discussion, spectrality should also be an element of the discussion, because I think it better applies to the threat of reoffending.
Okay, so John has asked, what do you think we should change in our approach to sex offenders flowing from your analysis?
The policy question, that's always, if I'm understanding your question correctly, John, somewhat, if it is a policy question, yes, okay. Good question, important question, and I will have one or two things to say. One thing is that empirical research, good empirical research, as I suspect you and most of the people here know, show that sex offenders' rates of recidivism are quite low, but directly having that discussion with parole agents, their supervisors and administrators told them about those studies and mentioned the recidivism rates being lower. I talked about with them, it's similar to what people have talked about with climate change, is if you just confront people with more science and more evidence, sometimes it can make them dig in even more deeply and say, no, I refuse to believe it. So what I want to say is, rather than having a good answer, I would say we're in a bit of a conundrum, because my response would be, well, let's make sure people understand that actually evidence shows they're not in recidivism isn't inevitable and inescapable, but there's some reason to suspect that just coming back with that is not enough, right? So good question. Maybe that's a larger discussion that we can continue beyond today.
Okay, so Armin has asked, he said, thanks for the interesting study. He asked, how do parole officers find victims of sex offences? He suggests that some victims of sex offences become sex offenders in the future. Do parole officers see them as monsters in the making?
Good question, and I can only speak a bit indirectly. I can't draw from my data too much, because I was not there for any times when parole agents met with victims. They did tell me about victim statements being in the parole files and being aware of who the victims were, but I can't recall any time when I was doing field work when we specifically got into victims. The extent that they got into victims, they talked about the victims rather than as specific persons, but more generically, in that we want to preempt reoffending and get these individuals who are dangerous sex offenders, get their parole revoked so that they don't create more victims. Although once or twice parole agents would note that, you know what, I've heard or I know that being a survivor increases the likelihood that you yourself can become a perpetrator later on. But even that knowledge still doesn't change the fact that once somebody is a convicted sex offender and seen as dangerous, they did see them as monstrous spectral threats. I think that's what I would say to that question.
Okay, so Kate has asked, would you say that this perceived spectrality is supported by evidence about sex offenders? Or in your opinion, do you think that these perceptions have dismissed a lot of evidence about how we should manage sex offenders?
Can you repeat it one more time, Elise?
Sorry, would you say that this perceived spectrality is supported by evidence about sex offenders? Or in your opinion, do you think that these perceptions have dismissed a lot of evidence about how we should manage sex offenders?
I don't think that this perception of spectrality is particularly, well, how do I want to answer this? Straight up, I'll say, no, I don't think it's necessarily supported by the evidence that reoffending is always happening, that it's always unfolding, that's always about to happen. No, I don't think it does. I think it is quite dismissive of the evidence, both the studies, but even the parole agents would sometimes admit that, you know what, even though I know that reoffending is certain, there may occasionally be a dangerous sex offender who doesn't reoffend. They may just somehow, right, because they've been ensconced enough in surveillance and electronic monitoring and they don't get the opportunity, they maybe won't reoffend. So there's, I think, a number of reasons to think, no, this idea that reoffending is always happening is not the case. But I think, or I hope, what my article is doing is getting into the minds and the ideas, the imaginaries of how parole agents see it. And the second step that I didn't talk very much about today is how this imaginary that sex offenders are morally monstrous, right? Morally different and other, and that they pose a spectral threat. Both these things together both incites and legitimizes their approach where they say, let's just lock these people up, whether or not they've reoffended or not. So I'm looking at how parole agents understand this and how that enables them to engage in what I consider to be quite exclusionary and harsh penal practices.
I think Danielle's question follows on well from that. She says that isn't the point that they're wrong. They're not monsters and they're not ghosts. They're human beings. They're seen as monsters and aliens and as ticking time bombs, but they're brothers, uncles, scoutmasters, gymnastics coaches, and mothers. The sooner we realize we're all in this together, the sooner we'll realize that we need to stop othering.
I'm going to take that as a fantastic comment. Yes, absolutely. No, these are human beings, right? They aren't monsters or ghosts. When I'm talking about that, I'm very much sticking with how the parole agents I did field work with understood them, but I could not agree more with that comment. So I would say, thank you for that comment.
So Penny has provided some feedback. I very much enjoyed your paper. I find the Foucauldian definition of monsters overly restrictive. I think it's worth thinking about the intersections and distinctions between monsters and ghosts. They're both creatures of horror, but I agree with you, Robert, that you often distinguish between monsters and ghosts. But there are definitely monstrous ghosts, e.g. in Japanese horror. I think your paper offers an opportunity to tease out some important distinctions between monsters and ghosts.
I love that comment. I love that comment very much. And yeah, I'm the Foucauldian definition of monsters. I'm not sure if Penny's referring to the historical animal and human mixed together, physically unnatural or morally unnatural, or all of the above. But I'm very much with you in that I think I'm trying to tease out distinctions between spectrality and monstrosity, but at the same time that I'm trying to show in my mind and in the paper that I think there are some differences and that monsters are present or not, and ghosts can be both. I also think it's important to look at the entanglements of monstrosity and spectrality. So I take that comment is very helpful and very useful to think with.
Okay, Brian has said your talk of apparition overlaps as magical stuff with Roger Lancaster's 2011 chapter, The Magic of Accusation, in his 2011 ethnography, Sex Panic and the Punitive State. And in his 2017 chapter of The War of Sex, he argues that what he and you depict are driving neoliberalism rather than a function of it. Are we, though, in need of attention to the social psychology of religion here, apart from political ideology per se?
Ooh. Good question, and one that I'm not sure how good of a response or just an engagement with that. I have read, and I cite Roger Lancaster in the paper, although I think I missed the Magic of Accusation 2011 piece somehow, which I will rectify that tomorrow, but I have read his book. And yes, arguing that this is driving neoliberalism rather than a function of it. But let me then ask, are we, though, in need of attention to the social psychology of religion here, apart from the political ideology per se? As a tentative answer, I think yes. I think we need to look a little bit about the sort of social psychology, the social imaginary of religion, of monsters, of ghosts. It's not strictly a political ideology. It's a deeply cultural ideology about how society works, what makes people tick, why are people the way they are. I think that gets outside of political ideology and gets into questions, as Brian noted, of religion. So I take that as both a question and a comment that I'm still thinking through. And yes, I think we do need to get outside of just political ideology. I mean, I think the level of affect here is immensely important, as you can see in my paper. The level of visceral, affective reality is an important part of what drives parole agents to see sex offenders the way they do.
Okay, David has said, Robert, I've just been watching Marcella, a British cop show, and like many other such shows, pedophilia is the focus crime, and so much of what you say about ghosts and spectrality is borne out in this and other such shows. It surprises me a little that your parole agents also seem to invoke similar imaginaries. Was there any reference by any of the parole agents to popular culture portrayal?
And I've started watching this most recent series of Marcella about sex offenders, but I haven't finished it. Now I really want to finish it, David, so thank you. There wasn't, as I recall, and I've been rereading my transcripts, listening to the interviews again, reading through my field notes, because it's been a few years actually since I was actively collecting data, although I'm still in touch with a number of my interlocutors. But there wasn't a whole lot of discussion, as I recall, of popular culture portrayals amongst them. Maybe I need to reread the field notes, but no, I just remembered. I will say this, and I want to give short answers because these are such great comments and questions. I want to hear as many of them as possible. But really there was an element when I was doing field work, throughout field work, where pro agents really wanted, some of them really wanted to educate me and make me understand that I was naive about sex offenders. Like they assumed correctly that I was the liberal subject who would see them as human beings, not as monsters, and would be open for rehabilitation, et cetera, et cetera. They saw me as naive as soon as I stepped in the door without even ever telling them any of those things. And they wanted to educate me on this subset of sex offenders that they saw as monstrous, pathological, irredeemable. They wanted to educate me on my naivete and show me how truly dangerous they were. So they would talk about instances of reoffending, about horrible harm that had occurred, about how they would get them to admit that they had really reoffended and maybe even done more than they had been convicted for. They wanted to educate me on these stories, going very deep into the ground of what these particular individuals did, rather than making as many pop cultural references. But I will be thinking more about that and finishing Marcella quite soon now.
John has commented, excellent talk, thank you. Danielle has said, thanks, Robert. Now, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong. I worked with the CASOMB for a number of years and interviewed a lot of probation and parole staff as well. The focus is largely wrong and getting us nowhere.
I hope that's not my talk, but that could be my talk. The focus of my talk is wrong and getting us nowhere, but I think I'm reading that. I'm going to read that generously and mean the focus of probation and parole.
I think that's what it means. Yeah. Kate has said, Robert, you should come to Australia/Victoria and speak to case managers who manage post-sentence offenders, high risk after their sentence is complete, to see if there are differences to practitioners in America.
I love that idea. I love that idea. So as soon as travel is a little bit more open, I very much like that idea, and we'll follow up with you actually.
Karen has said your parole officers should speak with reformed sex offenders, people who have successfully completed programming and have reintegrated into the community. These redemptive narratives offer a powerful way to counter the emotional response people have to sex offenders. Agreed.
I wholeheartedly, as a human being, as a person, very much agree with you. And you know what? I'm presenting my interlocutors as being exactly of the same mind, when I should note there were some gradations among these parole personnel who specifically supervised sex offenders. Yet a number of them had actually volunteered and wanted to supervise sex offenders. Not all of them, but several of them had. And I think in part because they feel like they did very much believe that these individuals were monstrous, irredeemable, absolutely going to reoffend if they get a chance. So they saw themselves as volunteering to try to protect society from these horrible menaces, from these spectral, ghostly, monstrous threats. But there were some parole agents who would allow for a little more room for maybe there might be one who can possibly change.
So Danielle has said your talk is great, and I think is confirming that she was talking about US probation and parole with her previous statement, and says, in my comparative work in Queensland, there's a huge difference between the approaches.
Okay. Maybe I'll have to come to Queensland as well. I was there about a year ago and look forward very much to getting back to Australia.
Okay, so we've got Lisa's just asked, it would be very hard to change your ideas if you worked in such a punitive culture.
I think many of these people of the parole agents who I worked with were very set. They didn't talk about the certainty of recidivism as an opinion. They talked about it as like a fact that they were educated. Many of them talked about it as a fact that they were educating me on them. And I think in a way, Lisa's comment highlights that this can become a recursive circle for them. As I'm speaking as if I were a parole agent, I'm certain they're going to reoffend. They're irredeemable, so I'm going to lock them up. Preemptively lock them up any chance I get. They break a rule, they show up late to a meeting, they break curfew, anything, I'll lock them back up. And then that in the parole agent's mind is they've just provided safety for the community, right? So it can be a self-reinforcing, I think, governance set between the imaginaries and the governance style. It can be self-reinforcing.
Danielle has said the strongest emergent theme for me in the US were the agents who came in all guns blazing and then met with case after case who were just guys who lacked social skills, cognitive skills, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in California, the parole agents there are also sworn in as law enforcement officers, and they carry weapons as well. So they are that kind of parole agent that's a mix of service, support, reentry with law enforcement, and they take that law enforcement component very, very seriously. In fact, I had one of these 8 parole agents, actually was a supervisor who supervised sex offenders, once had a conversation with me where he said, you know what, I think we are the people who do the most good for public safety. And I'm paraphrasing. He said, cops, for instance, are out there in the general public. So most of the people cops oversee are not dangerous. In the prison, yes, it's dangerous people, but they're all locked up. Whereas we as parole agents are supervising the very, very dangerous people who are in the community. So just a little bit of the mindset of a law enforcement person who thought they had the potential to do the most societal good vis-a-vis public safety.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. If there's any final questions or comments anyone wants to make. Oh, I can see one just popped up. Oh, hang on, maybe it's two. Two have popped up. CS Kenda, Robert, there certainly are those of us who work for parole working with sex offenders to minimise reoffending and rehabilitation in the hope that our work protects the community. I do my work with the belief that people can change, and certainly there are those exceptions.
Then that's fantastic. I wish you had been one of the people who I had done field work with, but unfortunately, the people I did field work with in California had a different approach to the dangerous sex offender. That doesn't necessarily mean all sex offenders, but thank you for that comment.
And Sean says, hi Rob, great talk of course. One quick note from my own time as a PO, I didn't work with sex offenders very often, but an experienced SO colleague's take on supervising sex offenders was, it's not these sex offenders that I'm worried about, it's the 99% we haven't caught.
Okay, thank you, Sean, for that comment. Although interesting, thinking about people they hadn't even caught, I suspect my parole agents thought about that as well, but they were, in the time I spent with them, very focused on the people who had been caught. And just, you know what, it may actually add something if I know who was perceived as quote unquote the dangerous sex offender as opposed to normal sex offender, not so irredeemable sex offender. The dangerous sex offenders amongst my parole personnel, my interlocutors, were people who, anything involving pedophilia, right? Anything involving somebody under 18, although that's more than just pedophilia. And then serial, people they considered quote unquote serial rapist and quote unquote stranger rapist. If people had a conviction offense, or particularly multiple conviction offenses for anything in there, they were generally going to be viewed as a dangerous sex offender, AKA somebody who is irredeemable and monstrous.
And this might be the final comment just before we finish. Oh, we've got another one that's popped up. Brian has said your reference to irredeemable triggers me to recall. So I'll read this and then I might read the second one. Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables and irredeemables in reference to some conjured section of Republican voters. This feels like some cultural line of polarity or something. Essentializing the evils makes me also think of Jeffrey Alexander on civil spheres and code switches. And I'll just read out, Clinician 17 said, I wonder if the conflation of law enforcement and the parole affects the monstrosity. The flip side of monstrosity is the hero and the paroled officers sounded like they saw themselves as going to war with monsters.
Ooh, I think I'll come back to Brian's comment in a moment, but yeah, I think that's a very interesting comment. And there is an element to this of putting on their guns and going out there and protecting the community and wanting to see themselves as doing an immense amount of good. So I think that comment is hitting on something that it was true for my interlocutors. And to Brian's comment, basket of deplorables and irredeemables, interesting parallel with Hillary Clinton. And I haven't read Jeffrey Alexander on civil spheres and code switches, but I'm going to put it in my notebook and look it up. So thank you for that comment, Brian.
I think now that it's just ticked over to midday, or at least in Sydney, I want to thank everyone for your comments and your questions, and thank Robert for his really fascinating talk and insights. And I think it's generated a lot of discussion and probably a lot of ideas for you moving forward.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. These were really good questions and comments. So I thank everybody very much for that and for attending and listening. I appreciate it greatly.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening/afternoon.
Thank you.